Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this, what I know is going to be a fascinating panel discussion today. And I want to thank you all for joining us as we kick off Healthy Soils Week, and also to make a note that today is United Nations Soil Health Day, or Soils Day, which is an important thing to celebrate when we think about how vital soils are as a natural resource, and one that we must take care of today, so that we can preserve these healthy soils for future generations. The proper functioning of this natural resource is absolutely essential to support life on this planet. Soils are home to enormous biodiversity, both in terms of the number of species and the functions these species perform. These functions and interactions of these species are the foundations for all ecosystem services. This biodiversity is under threat, as we know, due to climate change and past practices in properly managing our land. Many of these species we can't even see with the naked eye, but they're vital for soil structure formation, production and decomposition of organic matter, nutrient cycling, soil fertility, and productivity of the crops that feed us. Pest regulation and degradation of pollutants are several other vital services provided by the biodiversity in our soils. These microbial activities are also crucial in climate change, as they play a key role in determining whether or not our soils can act as a carbon sink by sequestering carbon in the soil. Governor Newsom's administration has laid out a natural and working land strategy that recognizes the importance of healthy lands and those soils in the state's goal for carbon neutrality. Sustainable soil management is critical to adapting to climate change while securing food productivity for all. CDFA earlier this year launched the Belowground Biodiversity Advisory Committee to better understand how soil biodiversity impacts soil health. Now, I can get totally geeked out on this stuff, and I hope you all will too today, because we've got some really great experts to talk to us about what is soil biodiversity, what are the important functions of this, and what are things that each one of us can do to preserve it. The committee is charged to prepare a report for us that we'll get later this year, I believe. Is that right, Ravneet? We'll get that report later this year. And I'm looking forward to their recommendations on biodiversity indicators as a proxy of soil health and ecosystem functions. So today you're going to hear from just a few of our committee members to hear a preview of this report and to better understand what these indicators are and what we need to be paying attention to. I'm going to quickly run through the introductions. I'm not going into their bios. I'm hoping we might get a 1-minute opportunity to ask them what they're most excited about in their work. But first, I just want to introduce our 4 panelists. We have Dr. Owen Brody, who is the Deputy Director of Climate and Ecosystem Sciences Division of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. We have Dr. Amanda Hodson, who's a research scientist at UC Davis. Dr. Jennifer Ridge, who is a senior scientist at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And we have Dr. Daniel Rath, who works as a soil scientist at UC Davis and is also with the National Resources Defense Council, NRDC. I hardly ever spell that out, Daniel, forgive me for that. So because we only have an hour, and this is a huge topic, I'm going to get started and just throw out the first question to our panelists. And hopefully you've all figured out the way that you want to respond to this to make sure that we get a chance to hear from everyone. So my first question really, truly is very, very basic. How does soil biodiversity contribute to healthy soils? Who's going to kick off the answer for me? Or do we have presentations? Owen, I know you're in charge of the slides today.
Yeah, we have presentations, and we're going to kick off, if that's okay with you, Secretary Ross, with a quick poll of the audience to see what the audience thinks of soil biodiversity, and then take it from there. How does that sound?
Great. That sounds
great.
Fun.
Okay. So I'm just going to toggle away from this screen for a second. Okay. And I am going to, okay, you can see my screen now, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll put that back in. So in the chat, you'll find a link to a Mentimeter poll The instructions are also here. And then I'm going to toggle on to the results screen. So if the audience wants to go to menti.com, use this code 81981667, or click on the link that's just been posted in the chat. And maybe Daniel, you can post that again in the chat just for those who are joining. And I will share the results of this, and then let's see what other people think of soil biodiversity.
We knew we were going to take a test right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning. Make sure people are awake. Okay. Oops. Other question. Soil is alive, microbes, function, complexity, microorganisms, fantastic. Carbon sequestration, function, carbon, the known microbes. Excellent. Variety, microbes, big microbe fans here. Excellent, excellent. Health, yes, exactly, health. Let's see, nutrient cycling. Fantastic. Okay. Nematodes.
Uh-oh.
The interconnected, balanced population. Wonderful, wonderful.
That's
okay,
great.
Air quality, earthworms, erosion, life, excellent. Okay, I think we've got an audience that really appreciates soil for its complexity, that contributes to soil health and soil quality and soil function, that connects to the atmosphere, connects to human well-being, connects to our planet. Fantastic. Okay, we're going to take a break from that. Keep going with your answers if you want. We'll record this and we can make them available at the end. And we're going to switch back to our slides now. And then I'm going to introduce some of my colleagues. Great. Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so first I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Pettridge, who has been introduced by Secretary Ross already. And Jennifer.
Great. If we could go ahead to the next slide, Owen. I just wanted to take a minute here to set the stage for what our committee and what we're hoping to talk about today is up to. So just a tiny bit of history. Back in September of 2020, Governor Newsom released Executive Order N8220. And this executive order established the importance of healthy soils and directed the CDFA to do what it could to advance efforts to conserve biodiversity in our soils using its existing authority and any new activities needed. So as part of that, they established the Belowground Biodiversity Advisory Committee. That's what all four of us who are going to be speaking to you today are part of. And what we call the BBAC, the BBAC committee, is doing is essentially, you could actually stay on the previous slide on, is we're looking at the possibility to identify metrics of soil biodiversity that support soil health. And as we're doing that, we're thinking about those metrics as different kinds of measurements. We're also thinking about indicators, which are parameters. They might be specific organisms or processes or functions that really tell us about the biodiversity of a system. And those might be surrogate ways to essentially assess both the health and biodiversity. We're in the process of working up our report. I happen to be part of the Frameworks Committee. Owen and Daniel and Amanda and others are working on different pieces of the report. We're putting that together over the course of the next few months, and we'll be sharing that with CDFA and with the state in a relatively short period of time. So let me now, with that backdrop, tell you a little bit about multifunctionality of soils. So if you could go to the next slide. And the reason that we're so focused on biodiversity. Says, I don't know if you can advance on, maybe it's not working so well today, but if you can go to the next slide. The reason that we want to think about the many different critical roles of soil is because they provide so much for our human societies and the healthy functioning of our planet. Everything from energy to security, to food security, to ecosystem services, water security. Soils provide 98.7% of the calories that are consumed by humans, but they do all of these other things as well that really establish what we call planetary survivability. They make it possible for us to exist on this planet. But by continuously focusing only on the provision of the food and the fiber and the energy, that's really intensified our agricultural practices in a way that's diminishing the capacity of soils to provide those other vital functions. And so those trade-offs are something that we need to really think about more carefully. So now getting to biodiversity, the real role of biodiversity is in establishing, again, this multifunctional nature. Not only do diverse soils that have many, many different kinds of organisms help us do things like build soil organic matter, pull carbon out of our atmosphere and put it back in the ground where it supports plant growth. They might fix nitrogen. They also have effects on the health of farm workers and people who are tilling the soil. The immunity of those individuals is shaped by the biodiversity of soil. The organisms in soil also have big effects on building soil structure and increasing and decreasing, affecting essentially the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced. And even further downstream, when we think about some of the residues that are left over after we've been managing soils, they might be involved in breaking down waste or in composting. If you, like I, are starting to put more in your green bin every week, a lot of that material is going to be broken down by diverse organisms that had originally come from soil environments. So all told, the soil biodiversity has multifunctional and very complex attributes, but we want to just give you a flavor for that today and introducing you to some of these different organisms and why we think it's so really critical that we preserve their diversity in our agricultural soil systems. So I'll hand it over at this point to Amanda.
Great. Okay, so some of you might be familiar with this idea of the human microbiome, that we have these sort of communities of organisms living on us and within us, and that we are really not alone, that there's this interaction with our microbial communities that determines how well we're able to digest food and how healthy we are. And the soil and the root specifically is very much the same. Roots have their own microbiomes, as in this picture with the kind of fuzzy root hairs around the root that's teeming with bacteria in the picture below. There's also a lot of even viruses, natural soil viruses that are involved in carbon and nutrient cycling. There's tiny microscopic worms, nematode worms, which are my specialty. I study pest suppression of nematodes and also them as indicators of soil health. There are mites and collembolans up there. There's some symphylans. There's just a huge diversity of creatures that are all underneath us. And this soil biodiversity is really, the ground, it's in the ground, but it's also supporting us, kind of as the ground supports us underneath us. And I like to think of it in sort of three ways. Soil biodiversity is self-existing. It's not really working for us or against us. It's living its own life. It's just self-existing, and it's also very responsive. So it matters it will respond to our management. And it's just up to us whether we want to try to work with that soil biodiversity or if we are actively working against it or neglecting it. And soil biodiversity is very alive and dynamic. And so it's like human societies, it's very complicated. So what we do in one situation might not have the same effects in one location versus another. So we can move to the next slide. So the theme of World Soil Day this year is soils. where food begins. And I think that's a really beautiful, beautiful way of thinking of, you know, this community underneath us that's literally feeding us. I like to think of soil health as this sort of synergistic relationship between ecological functioning and agronomic functioning. So our concept of soil health is something that is a collaboration with the soil biology, because the soil biology is just doing what it wants to do. It's doing carbon cycling, it's doing nitrogen cycling. All of these organisms are eating each other and interacting, but we can synthesize that with what we want to happen into a better agronomic functioning. So in this picture at the top, there's some little roly-polies and earthworms. And these ones are sometimes described as leaf litter transformers. They'll shred the leaf litter into smaller pieces so that fungi and bacteria can start working on it. This might not just be leaf litter in a forest. You could also think of this as organic inputs in an agricultural system, mulch, compost, some sort of soil amendment that we've added. The bacteria and fungi are eaten by protists and bacterial feeding nematodes. Then there's omnivorous nematodes that are eating both of those things, and predatory mites and collembola. And the whole thing gets very complicated very quickly. And alluded to in our title, this is a network of interactions that has emergent properties. And these relationships between these organisms, as they're eating each other, they're cycling nutrients, they're excreting things into their environment, they're cycling carbon, and they're involved in the formation of organic matter. So it's actually not just the organisms themselves that are creating nutrient cycling and soil organic matter, it's the relationships between them. We can move to the next one. So a lot of the scientific literature has been looking at the importance of soil biodiversity, and they've found that in general, more soil biodiversity is linked to increased disease and weed suppression. There's a greater resilience to environmental stress like drought or other stress, and increased plant production. This is just in general, often in kind of microcosm studies in a laboratory. But what we want to know is how much and what kind of food web complexity is optimal. How much do we need in a given environment, and what groups are good indicators? Do we want to look at DNA sequences in the top there of bacteria and fungi? Do we want to look at predatory nematodes like this one that has a spear that can harpoon other soil organisms and suck out their body wall contents? That's pretty cool. Are those important? Do we want to count something really easy to see like earthworms? Do we care about these little collembolans, like this little cute black guy standing on a grain of sand? Or do we care more about fungi? What are these all telling us about food web complexity and ecosystem functioning? So we'll go to the next slide. And then I just want to end with kind of an example of how this soil biodiversity influences an ecosystem process. So one of the really things that's exciting to me about science right now in soil biology is that they found that the most stable soil organic matter is largely made up of dead microbes. So in this diagram, there's inputs coming from leaves and roots and maybe organic amendments. And those might be simple compounds or more complicated compounds. But in either way, a lot of it is broken down by something kind of called the microbial factory or the microbial pump. And some of that is released, as those microbes breathe, they release some carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But a large portion of the carbon is stored in this more stable carbon pool that is composed of partially decomposed plant material, metabolites from the microbes, even the dead bodies of the microbes themselves. The sugars from them are actually acting like a glue to protect that soil carbon and stabilize it in the soil so that it is not released as carbon dioxide. So a really big question right now is, how can management influence the soil food web so that we get more of these microaggregates, that we get more of this microbial necromass and stable carbon? Okay, then I think with that, I'll turn it over to Daniel.
Sounds great. So yeah, I'm gonna very quickly expand a little bit on the topics that Dr. Hodson and Dr. Petridge already introduced, which is number one, that soil biodiversity is multifunctional. So it accomplishes many different processes simultaneously because of the interactions that are happening between various organisms. And these processes that are happening are very integral to the concept of healthy soils. As Dr. Hodson just mentioned, it's exemplified in processes like soil organic matter formation and the formation of soil structure. The process of decomposition of plant residues is a collaboration between many different size classes, many different groups of organisms. You have the earthworms and the ants and the termites that are helping to shred these larger pieces of plant residue. You have the microscopic fungi and bacteria that are breaking the bonds between these carbon atoms, liberating that energy for other functions. And the formation of soil structure is one of those very important functions. It's this collaboration, again, between bacteria that secrete these sticky glues that hold soil particles together, and the fungi and the roots that form a type of net holding larger aggregates together. I mean, pest and disease resistance is like one of the best examples. The soils that help plants to resist the impacts of pests such as fusarium do so largely because of the interactions between these organisms, the competition for resources, the predation, the parasitism that helps to suppress these disease-causing populations. Next slide. Okay, so this biodiversity, however, and by extension, the functions that the biodiversity carries out is currently under threat. And one of the biggest threats in climate change, and it will come as no surprise to anyone to hear that in California, this is largely related to changes in the amount and availability of water. Now, soil organisms need water to survive and function. Most soil microorganisms are aquatic. They exist in this thin film of water surrounding soil particles, and the increased chance of drought, increased temperatures, and increased water management means that a larger portion of the soil is going to have to deal with reduced water availability, which threatens the ability of that soil to carry out the functions that are so important. Extreme events such as floods and fires can also impact and increase erosion and the loss of nutrients and organic matter. Next slide. So soil biodiversity is also really threatened by land use change. Agricultural soils are different from natural ecosystems. They experience different pressures, and we want different things from them. However, the increased disturbance associated with converting a native ecosystem to an agricultural ecosystem can result in a loss of soil biodiversity. There's the potential for further biodiversity loss if you remove that plant cover when land is converted to fallow. This lack of soil cover can potentially increase erosion, and the removal of the organic carbon water inputs associated with agriculture and the presence of living roots can mean that there are even fewer resources available to soil organisms. Go next. This strong response of below-ground biodiversity to land management presents both a threat and an opportunity. So management practices like soil fumigation and intensive tillage can have a really strong negative impact, not just on the specific organisms that they're targeting, but again, because these below ground networks are multifunctional, it can have negative impacts on the entire network of organisms. On the other hand, practices like planting perennial grasses and increasing organic matter inputs and limiting tillage can have a really strong positive impact. So this interaction between management practices and soil biodiversity are really dependent. They're dependent on the timing, they're dependent on the intensity and the environmental context of a particular area. And this is why it's really important that we try to understand just how biodiversity below ground is affected by agriculture, and within that context, what we can do to protect it. And I'll pass that off to Owen.
Great, thanks, Daniel. I just want to bring us back to the formation of our committee that we're representing here today. And as we identified and mentioned already, the 30 by 30 really is about enhancing efforts to conserve biodiversity, including soil health and biodiversity in soils. And as part of our charge, as Secretary Ross already mentioned, our goal is to develop both the information and to recommend a process for how CDFA can first assess biodiversity and also connect biodiversity to soil health and function with specific relevance for agroecosystems. And I want to come back to this concept of a network. So we think of soil biodiversity as webs or maybe as lists of types of organisms, but really it's this interconnected network that provides this multifunctionality that we're hearing about here. And this really changes the approach when you think about quantifying and measuring soil biodiversity and connecting it to ecosystem functioning when you're talking about multifunctionality. And we began this presentation by talking about a social network, the soil social network beneath our feet. And I want to give you an example of two different social networks and how they change over time here. We've got the social network on the top that you see by the numbers of different colored dots that are connected. There's fairly limited connectivity on the top here, and it doesn't change so much over time. Whereas on the bottom here, you start to see these connections, they're more robust, more nodes are connected to each other, things are interacting more, and over time, these interactions build. So you've got this real coordination and collaboration, as we heard, forming over time. Now, let's see, can anybody predict what these, why these networks are different? Well, let's see, you wanna know? Okay, the ones on the top are soils with no roots. And the ones at the bottom are soils with roots. So roots growing through a soil are feeding microbes. They're feeding the organisms that feed on microbes. The viruses that infect microbes and turn microbes over are changing. There's this cascading effect that occurs when roots grow through soil. So as Daniel said, the planted soil versus the fallow soil, the social networks of microbes are very different, and therefore the biodiversity and the multifunctionality comes from this, or at least we think it does. There's more research needs to be done to build these connections between the structure of these social networks below ground and multifunctionality. But that work is happening, and it's happening globally. Within California, we have a wide range of experts, and a number of experts have been requested or invited to participate on this committee, the Belowground Biodiversity Advisory Committee, chaired by Kate Scow with myself and Margaret Smither-Copperell, who's on today. And we've brought experts together that represent the different components of biodiversity in soil and their interactions. You've heard from Jennifer and Amanda and Daniel, and together with the rest of our committee, we'll be providing this report to CDFA and recommendations, but we'd also like to hear from you and what you think about is important for biodiversity in California and how it connects to agroecosystems. So we're looking forward to the discussion towards the end here. I want to finish with this. So here we have our network, and Jennifer talked about providing recommendations for framework. How do we connect the complexity in these networks to what we care about in agroecosystems? And that's the provision of multifunctional ecosystem services. Well, other groups have been working on this, and we've got close collaborations and partnerships with groups in Europe who've been developing these platforms that connect the individual components and the interactions of these individual components or the biodiversity in soil with specific functions. Once you start to build those connections between the individual organisms, how they interact with each other, and then the services that we're expecting from agroecosystems, these multifunctional services, water regulation and purification, nutrient cycling, disease and pest management, and carbon sequestration and climate regulation, for example, then we start to have a direct path between improvement of biodiversity or loss of biodiversity and the potential consequences for functioning in agroecosystems. So with that, I'd like to say, just make one suggestion, and that's something that will be necessary to be able to make these connections, is that we're going to require an information system to be able to build our understanding of the soil social network in California. We need to organize this information. We need to be able to leverage and connect that information, take advantage of programs like the Health Soils program to quantify biodiversity and its connections to agro-ecosystem function. So we'll finish there. And now I'd like to ask you to again go to the Mentimeter poll. If Daniel, if you can put the link for this into chat, but again, you can go to menti.com and use 35113795. And we want you to just share what you think, what concepts of soil biodiversity were new to you, and has anything we've shared today changed your opinion of soil biodiversity?
Owen, I think the chat is disabled, so if you could leave that slide up with the Menti link so that people.
Oh, sure, yes. Okay, so go to menti.com, and use the code 35113795. And what concepts of soil biodiversity were new to you? Social network, drought changes lives, yes. Root structure, excellent. Deep roots, the role of sugars, pest management, yes. Soils help resist pests, exactly. Pest management, yes. Role of nematodes, research opportunities, exactly, yes. This is an ongoing area of research.
Yeah.
Something of this complexity.
Yeah. Oh, and it's probably not fair for me as moderator to put in my own question here, but I can't help myself because we are California, Mediterranean climate with sporadic rainfall, and it's changing in its pattern. And there's a group of folks that are really working hard on, is it an appropriate use of a water budget to put in cover crops or other things, because we know that we can increase water holding capacity. And I'm just wondering where the science is taking us on that, to be able to prove the myth or bust the myth on using water budgets for cover crops in the wintertime.
It's a great question. I'm going to, Daniel, would you like to take that?
Punt it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I will do my best. I think that one of the main things here is that there's the conditions are changing, and so less water availability than there would have been for native ecosystems in the past. But there's, I can't speak to whether or not it's an appropriate use of water. I can say that there are sort of like drought tolerant native plants that are the presence of living roots in the soil is the main thing here. And so if you're able to like find a way to have these either, there's concepts like dryland farming, sort of rain-fed farming, and these plants that are able, like a lot of times perennial roots are able to infiltrate deeper and access water that's held deeper in the soil. And so, all of these can be things that help to reduce water usage on specific areas of land while still protecting soil biodiversity.
Okay. I was wondering if Margaret, with all the work she's done at Lockford, if she's got anything she wants to add to that.
Yes, actually I would. Cover crops, I think more and more of the research that we're doing, especially over the winter, is showing that actually cover crops do not cause a net loss in water. That if you have cover crops, you do get greater infiltration into the soil because of the roots. I'm a strong believer that dew has a factor in some locations for sure. You go out there in the morning and the plants are moist, and plants, if there's a little moisture, they're natural water collectors. And, we do know that as organic matter builds up in the soil, there's more water holding capacity. But I think it does take a time. And I think the time for termination is going to be absolutely critical. If you leave the cover crops in there a little longer in the spring, when they get bigger and they're bolting and maturing, they will compete with the cash crops. So we want to be careful with that. There's still a lot that we don't know, but I'm very hopeful that we can use cover crops very effectively to increase moisture.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Owen, for indulging me, but I'll let you go back to what did you see on the screen of the words that you got back?
No problem. That was a perfectly timed question as well. Right in the middle here, I think, and these words are scaled by the number of their responses. Dead microbes, so microbial factory. I think this highlights the importance, the role of sugars. Roots feed microbes. That soil is a living system and requires nourishment. It requires food. It requires food in the form of carbon to microbes. It requires nutrients, and many of those microbes provide those nutrients to each other and also to plants. So this idea that carbon transits from a growing plant and the dying and decaying parts of plants through microbes. Microbes, the factory of microbes converts that into other forms of carbon, glues minerals together, sticks that carbon onto mineral surfaces, and then that carbon becomes long-lived carbon in soil and is the basis for carbon sequestration. So biodiversity is central and essential for carbon sequestration. And that requires us to think about how we feed microbes. You know, soil is a great example of how soil is a living, dynamic entity.
Yeah, my favorite thing is if we feed the soil will continue to feed us. We just have to figure out what the soil's diet is, right?
Exactly. Yes.
So Jennifer, this is a question I have for you because at the international level, and I was just at the COP in Egypt, and that's only the second COP that I've been able to go to, but we spend a lot of time having conversations about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I was really thrilled to see you put those on that screen because the intersection of agriculture and food productivity is really elemental to a number of those Sustainable Development Goals. Do you want to expand on that just a little bit? We don't seem to spend as much time on it in a very intentional way here stateside, I don't believe.
I'd be happy to. I think that we do need to start to think of our soils in more multiple dimensions. I think that we've long thought about them as supporting our human sort of direct needs for, like I said, food, fuel, and fiber. But the fact that they also relate to our energy security, I think for a lot of people, at first they kind of might tilt their head and say, really? But the amount of carbon that's stored in soils is greater than what's in the atmosphere and the biosphere combined. So it's just this huge, huge bolus of carbon that balances, it really buffers our climate. The oceans are also obviously very important, but over the past 100 years, 200 years, through the practice of intensive agriculture and plowing, we've tilled a lot of soils, and honestly, all of that wonderful microbial activity has the downside of liberating a lot of CO2 that's ended up in the atmosphere, and that's a natural process, but we need to be thinking about it more carefully, and that the fact that it's in our atmosphere is causing all these downstream effects of climate warming, and that circles back to affecting our energy cycle. And so what we call decarbonizing our energy sector is going to be important, but also thinking about pulling some of that CO2 using plants out of the atmosphere and putting it back in the ground is another big goal. And we call that carbon dioxide removal. So that's, just one piece of this sort of multifunctional nature of soils that I think we don't always recognize that's in my mind just as important as making sure that they're continuing to be healthy for the products that we take out of soils.
Great, I appreciate that. I see we're getting lots of questions. I'm going to ask one lightning round question of each one of you. If you can tell me something that you think is the most exciting recent discoveries in soil diversity, and I'm just going to start with Owen and go through the line.
Thanks, great. Yeah, I think for me, what exemplifies connectivity in soil is the mycorrhizal information highway. I think that was one thing that really brought it together for me, and that the fact that plants are connected, plants and microbes through this mycorrhizal highway. an information superhighway are connected in soil, and that provides resilience through connectivity. And when we break that highway, when we sever those linkages, we break that connectivity, and then we make our soils vulnerable. So that was really exciting and changed my view of how soils work.
Very cool. How about you, Amanda?
I'm really excited about this relationship between complexity in soil food webs and dead microbes and carbon cycling. I want to spend the rest of my career untangling that one.
All right. Well, we wish you good luck.
Just giving it, I think a lot has to do with how do we feed the soil food web appropriately, how do we listen to it so that it doesn't just burp out all this carbon back into the atmosphere, but that it actually can digest it and incorporate it into itself.
I like that term, not burping it all out. It's not just cows that burp, right? Jennifer?
I've got to take this moment to talk about viruses in soil because they are just the neatest thing that in my landscape. We're learning that the number of and the diversity of viruses in soils is just enormous. And we really have very, very little understanding of how they relate to these processes of carbon turnover, nitrogen, phosphorus. And, we probably when the general public thinks of viruses, they think of them as not being good, right? That as being pathogens. Right. But in soil, as they are in the oceans, they could be actually performing a really important function of just liberating carbon and nutrients that are held up in microbes and other life forms. So they're part of turning the wheel on the microbial pump. But we just don't have a good handle on how much, maybe it's a 1% effect, maybe it's a 50% effect. So we really got to learn more about the viruses.
Interesting. I'm hearing career paths for everybody here. How about for you, Daniel?
I would say to go with the theme of interaction, one of the things that has most interested me is the interaction between various management practices and the soil microbiome. So instead of looking at just one management practice, can you have synergistic effects if you apply 2 or more? A good example is cover crops and compost. Maybe cover crops allow greater infiltration into the soil. If you have a lot of soluble nutrients in the compost, does that move deeper into the soil through these pathways? And then does that affect the soil microbiome because of these combinations of practices? So that's a most exciting one for me.
That's great. And there's so many questions here. And I'm probably going to have to pop off a little bit early. So Rob Neat's going to help me with this. But the first question was put in quite some time ago, and it's really a follow-up to the conversation we just had. And that is, if we have a better understanding of how agrochemicals may negatively influence the microbiome of soil and how to possibly mitigate that. I think it ties back to the soil fumigation issues and some other questions that have come up. I'm sure any one of you can answer that, but who wants to take it first?
I'm happy to jump in first, at least. Anyway, I think a great example, if we think about soils, plants, and microbes, they've co-evolved over evolutionary time. So those relationships they go back a long, long way. They predate us. And so they've built up these sort of trading schemes where microbes or plants give carbon, microbes give nutrients. We kind of know how that works. But if we come in and we can short circuit those trading schemes by providing too much nutrients, for example, or too much nutrients of the wrong form, or too much nutrients that are supplied too quickly, we break those sort of delicate negotiations, and then we break these networks. So that's one example in thinking of intensive fertilization, for example. Other agrochemicals and pesticides, for example, directly inhibit specific members of the soil microbiome and other members of the soil community. And so if you think about that in terms of the network I showed, some of those nodes are being severed, they're being disconnected. And so the functions, not just of those microbes or those organisms that they perform, but the functions that they enable are also being impacted by agrochemicals.
Did anyone else want to add to that? We've only got 13, 14 other questions to try to run through.
I just want to add that it's not over.
Yes.
Even if you fumigate, you have not sterilized your soil, and it's not the end of the story. Like, it's always alive. It's always going to respond to future things.
Thanks for that, Amanda. Ravneet, are you ready to take over? I just want you all to know how much I loved this. It makes me wish I was back in like a freshman in high school, like thinking science is the greatest thing ever to be in, but soil being a living complex just gets me so excited about the possibilities. Seems like we should know more than we do already, but guess what? You and many other smart people are working on it along with our farmers and ranchers. So thank you very much for letting me be a part of this session. And I'm going to jump off, Ravneet. Thank you very much. And thank each one of you.
Thank you, Secretary Ross. It was really interesting. If I may ask one of the questions, I think that's more important from California point of view, if I may. Anyone or all of you can respond to that. And my question would be, what are some of the unique things that are about the California soils, or the biodiversity that California has underneath its soils? You want to start with okay, Jennifer,
Sure, I'd be happy to start. I will say that we have these things called soil maps, and if you've never seen one, it's remarkable for the state of California. It's got all these different little pockets of different types of soils. They're made of different mineral components and have different textures. And that means they also have different chemical ability to sustain plant growth. And across the state, particularly in the Central Valley, and even up into the foothills, we just have an enormous diversity. Some of the broadest diversity I've ever seen, in a single state. And some of that is because our Central Valley used to have vernal pools. It used to have a lot of complexity out there. And some of that we've kind of covered over with our, orchards and our pastures and row crops. But there's actually still quite a diversity of agricultural uses, right? We've got Hmong farmers doing polyculture, and we've got giant, many, 1,000-hectare orchard groves. So there's actually quite still a lot of diversity in our states, the way that we use our soils, probably more than many other agricultural states. And then the last thing I'll just say is that we have these extra kind of layers of, as you know, kind of drought that is intensifying, that exacerbates the sort of natural likelihood of a lot of our soils to have issues with salinity, right? So when we have a lot of evaporation, that leaves the salts behind, and those can be problematic, and we can sometimes make that worse through our fertilization practices. So I'll just say that the key word for me in our state is that there's no one single issue. There are really many issues, and it really depends where you are. So as a result, there's not one solution. There's probably going to be many different kinds of solutions, and it's going to depend what specific soil type and what types of crops are being talked about.
Yeah, panel member want to add?
Ravneet, you asked about what's unique about our below ground biodiversity. I think that's a great question. I think there have been a number of surveys of below ground biodiversity in California, but this goes back to the point that I was making, that we really need to be able to compile this information and organize standardized surveys across the state. Because of this complexity and diversity of systems that Jennifer mentioned, it really is a major challenge in quantifying biodiversity, and that needs to be a coordinated effort across many organizations across the state. Yeah, and I think CDFA can play a really important role in that.
Thank you. And if I may ask another question that was kind of very personal to me, just being a part of CDFA. How do you think that soil diversity interacts with California agriculture, and how the farmer and rancher can help improve that? I think we touched upon it, but it would be nice to just kind of being more focused on our agriculture that is fairly diverse as well. I want to take this out, Amanda.
I'd say a little bit. I mean, I think the first step is just acknowledging that soil biology is there and it's playing a role. and starting to have that conversation with it, because it's going to be a very regional thing. I mean, that might mean planting some test strips of cover crops. I mean, it's going to be a localized relationship with whatever is there. And so I think that's, to me, the first kind of step. There's not going to be a one size fits all, but it's going to be a strange kind of relationship.
Daniel?
Yeah, I think too, one of the main things is just sort of educating and like people understanding like the various benefits of soil biodiversity can bring, not just to like agricultural production as it is now, but to agricultural production in the future, sort of how the soil biodiversity will increase the resilience of these agricultural systems to climate change, whether it's mycorrhizae helping to get nutrients throughout the soil, potentially helping to get water, and how sort of the things that are happening with climate change are going to impact soil biodiversity and maybe change the ways that we need to interact with it.
Thank you. I think we can take at least there is somebody from the public has their hand raised, so let me give them a chance. We have Claire Room. I'm going to unmute you, Claire. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thanks.
Wonderful. This has been really a wonderful presentation and obviously barely scratches the surface of a really complicated issue, but also a really important one. I trained as an infectious disease physician, and so I'm quite familiar with the astonishing literature on the gut microbiome. And I can tell you, after probably millions of dollars of research and hundreds of publications, most impressive thing is how much we do not know. And I suspect the same thing is going to be true for the soil microbiome. So I second Dr. Brody's suggestion that information systems are essential. I think it's helpful to acknowledge what we don't know, but therefore, if CDFA can do systematic, granular, standardized information collection, then there is the opportunity to do observational data analysis and understand what you've got. And the other point is, I really appreciate this committee's efforts to define metrics. And I would suggest that focusing on a few key outcome metrics, again, which will help you determine what information to be collected, can be really helpful. So I can't wait to see what your committee does. And I think thinking about the informatics, the information science, and the measurement science up front will provide invaluable utility for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. We are fairly close to the top of the hour, so let me take this opportunity to first of all thanks our panelists for their time today. And also I would like to extend the thanks to all members of Belowground Biodiversity Advisory Committee who are spending a lot of time preparing this report. We look forward to the report. And I would also like to thank Special Assistant Kayla Unger, who is spearheading our Healthy Soils Week activities. And I would like to also thank Deputy Secretary Virginia Jameson for her leadership, and our Information Officer Josh Cobb. I will leave you with this quote from President Franklin Roosevelt, who wrote this to all state governors in response to the dust storms of 1930s. Our 32nd president wrote that a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And with that, I am really grateful to everybody who was able to join in today. I hope this was informative for you. we would like to see you in one of the activities that are being hosted by CDFA and its partners. For more information, please log on to cdfa.ca.gov/healthy soils. With that, thank you very much, everyone. Bye.